Okay, we have a drought update. Go ahead, Ms. Clerk.
Item number 15, subject Stage 3 drought update.
Okay. Staff is getting ready. Very good, Ms. Dyer.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, council members. My name is Kelly Dyer. I'm the water supply manager, and I will be giving the drought update today. I'll be walking through the drought status, the demand status, our water supply status, as well as an updated water supply strategy. Now that the rainy season is essentially over, we've gone through and updated the condition of all of our water sources. This is something we typically do twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall. So the drought status, the rainfall for this year, this water year, it was below normal. We measured at Gibraltar and Kachuma, which is reflective of our supply conditions. And we also measured in downtown Santa Barbara, which is reflective of demands. As we have more rainfall, there's less irrigation demands. In all cases, it was about 50% of normal, so we had another dry year. And this is a chart prepared by federal agencies. It's a very broad scale drought monitor, and they have deemed Santa Barbara County, as well as our neighbors in Ventura County, as being in a severe drought condition. As we all know, the city has remained in a stage 3 drought emergency for several years. We did not receive the reprieve that other parts of the state has received. Our demand status, we had a 31% reduction in water use compared with 2013 demands. We used 2013 for reporting to the state. That is a requirement every month. And so we are meeting our target. We have a 36% 12-month running average conservation. Our current target is 30%, so we are exceeding that. This chart shows our water sales, our revenue from water rates. It's an unaudited chart, but we do track it just to see if there are any shortfalls in revenue. For the month of April, we did see it drop below projections, but that has been offset by previous months where revenues came in a little higher. So far for the year, we're above our projections for year to date. All right, so getting into each of our water supplies, Gibraltar Reservoir is currently full. It's at 98% of capacity. We did have a spill this year. It was very small. It was only about 280 acre feet that spilled, and that ended in late April. It was somewhat of it was a challenging situation for water quality. In years prior, when we had Gibraltar spilling, it was enough inflow that it actually cycled through the reservoir, and we had a substantial spill, which helped flush out some of that initial ash and sediment that we receive. This year, the first flush basically filled up in the reservoir and sat there. We didn't get much of that spilling over. So the water quality is very challenging at Gibraltar right now. We have high turbidity and TOC. We have started diversions, but it's a very minimal amount. We're not diverting as much as we did last year. We are continuing to monitor water quality, and we'll try to maximize those diversions as much as we can, but we're still essentially testing the system to see how much we can divert. Kachuma is currently at about 40% of capacity. Didn't really receive any substantial inflows to Kachuma this year for the Kachuma member units. We have a 40% allocation for this current water year, and the city's portion of storage is about 7,100 acre feet. Our storage is made up of the current year allocation as well as carryover from previous years. If conditions remain dry, COME will need to consider reinstalling the emergency pumping facility. It's projected that emergency pumping facility would have to be operational by summer of 2019. That's when the lake level is projected to drop below our intake and will no longer gravity flow. COMB has been looking at various options for installation of the pilings. Our current contract would have, with the Cushman, who's the contractor for this project, originally called for installing the pilings about a year earlier. And COM has been working on options to delay that. We'll have to do a change order to the contract. But Janet Gingras, the general manager at COM, has been working very collaboratively with all the member units as well as the downstream interests. That's another factor that goes into our lake level projections are the downstream releases every summer. There's a substantial amount of water released for water rights. And Bruce Wales from the Santa Ynez River Water Conservation District has agreed to release 10,000 acre feet, which would help us and position us to being able to delay installation of the piling. So it was a really great collaborative effort to meet the objectives of the member units and trying to postpone the costs of reinstalling these pilings while also meeting the objectives of downstream interest for groundwater recharge. Again, no decisions on this have been made. This will be something this summer that COM will have to consider the various options for potentially delaying the installation of the pilings. But we do have some options to consider. Imported water, we continue to maximize our delivery to Kachuma. The city's portion of the pipeline is about 280 acre feet per month. We have about 1,100 acre feet stored in Kachuma as of now. We have about 1,000 acre feet stored at San Luis Reservoir and about 100 acre feet at a groundwater bank in Palmdale. DWR allocation was actually updated yesterday. I had thought that May 1st would be the final allocation, but DWR did come out, I believe it was yesterday, with a 35% allocation. So that doesn't necessarily change our supply outlook substantially, but it is good news that it went up by 5%. Supplemental water purchases and exchanges. The city has been pursuing about an exchange of about 1,500 acre feet with Mojave Water District. This would help continue to keep our portion of the pipe flowing full through 2019. That purchase price was about $320 an acre foot. So that's about $500,000 in total for the 1,500. And it's a 4-to-1 exchange. So for every 4 acre feet that we receive, we would have to return 1 acre foot. And we have about a 10-year period to do that. When we return the water, there's a cost of $250 per acre foot. That's the transportation costs to get it to Mojave Water District. So that adds about $100,000 to the purchase price. All of this was within the budgeted amounts for this fiscal year. And I think it was actually one of the best deals that we found so far with our supplemental water purchase program. Our water debt with that deal would increase up to 3,675 acre feet. We have several years to pay that off. It's not as high as it has been in earlier years of the drought. We were upwards over 5,000 acre feet of water debt. So still a manageable number. Our groundwater is currently at relatively low levels, although we do have some remaining yield in the basin. That's based on modeling with the USGS. We have a modeling study that estimates the drought yield. We have about 30% of that yield remaining. So we are preparing some of our wells, about 3 out of the 9, for potentially bringing them online this summer, depending on what happens with Gibraltar water quality. If we're not able to use much of Gibraltar, we would want to turn on some of the wells this summer. Desalination project, I'm going to leave for Mr. Hagmark to provide an update on that.
Joshua Hagmark, Water Resources Manager. So the plant continues to operate at full production, which is great. The water quality is exceptional. Really glad to have that part of our diverse supply mix. And we were just here on May 1st to report on the Montecito Water District negotiations. We have had our first kickoff meeting and are working through issues, and hope to have something to share with the council in late July, August.
Thanks.
Okay, in our recycled water, we haven't had this slide in here for a while, but I wanted to remind everyone that we do have a recycled water system. It's an important part of our water supplies. Our plant continues to operate with current maximum production of 1.7 MGD. That is meeting all the demands on our recycled water system, so we are not using any potable water or any of our groundwater to meet the demands on the recycled system. And our secondary aeration project at the wastewater treatment plant is expected to wrap up in early 2019. And when that's completed, we expect that the production of our recycled water plant would increase up to 3 MGD, which was the originally planned capacity. And now into the water supply strategy. I wanted to just walk through some background and give the basis of our water supply strategy. We have an adopted long-term water supply plan, which is what we've used. It really it's a policy document on how we manage our supplies during droughts. And it looks out to 2030. And an important part of that plan was strong conservation efforts that keep our demands down. So even over time, as we increase population, our demands were always projected to go down over time. And that plan was based on the worst drought of record at the time, which was 1947 to 52. That's now the second worst. We've had much drier conditions in this drought, and we've also had longer duration. The other part of our planning is a water shortage contingency plan, which is required by the state every 5 years. This is how you reduce your demands during times of shortage. So the city has outlined 3 stages. We're currently in the 3rd level, which is the highest level of water shortage. And we have planned reductions to address those shortages, as well as reactivation of the desalination facility. And it's just a summary of some of the management actions on the supply side as well as the demand side. During droughts, we increase our groundwater pumping. Our groundwater really is a drought and emergency source. We don't use it very much during normal periods. Same with state water. The state water project is considered a drought supply for the city, so we increase our use of that. Our demand reductions are achieved through various ways. One is through adjustments of our water rates. We have tiered rate structure with volumetric rates, so as we increase as demands are reduced, we need to make adjustments to water rates in order to achieve our revenue requirements. We have regulations as needed, and those really have been implemented in the drought so far under 3 scenarios. One has been if the conservation target was not being achieved, if the state had requirements that we had to adopt, and also if there was a near-term shortage within the next year where we needed to take measures to ensure that demands were reduced temporarily. We've also, throughout the drought, increased our outreach, and our water conservation staff, their workload has pretty much quadrupled through the drought, and they've done a great job throughout. And then desalination is our other drought supplies as well. So I just wanted to show a chart. This on the left was the chart from our long-term water supply plan. And this was our planned supplies. On the right is what's actually happened in the current drought. Couple key things. So on the left-hand side, you see the dark blue chart. That was the projected Kachuma allocations during a drought. So previously, there were always some inflows to Kachuma that would allow for an allocation. As you can see on the right, by the 4th year, we were receiving a 40% allocation, and then we actually received a 0 allocation in 1 year. For the last 4 years, we've had very limited allocations from Kachuma. The other aspect of this chart to consider is in the plan, it was really by policy that we considered an acceptable level of shortage to be 10 to 15%. So in other words, we were not going to develop our supplies to have 100% reliability. We thought we can manage a 15% shortage with planned reductions in demands. Because of the lack of surface water that we've had in this drought, we've had to reduce our demands by 20 to 40%. So it's far beyond what was the original planned policy level of shortage. And finally, our plan was for 6 years. We've already seen 7 years. And now we're going to be looking ahead for 3 more years. So now we have essentially a 10-year plan. So as for where we are right now, in the current water year, our goals were to ensure adequate supplies for at least 2 more years through 2020, and to try and delay actions that would have additional financial impacts if we could. So that's from the supply management side. That would be cost of additional supplies, such as expanding desal. And on the demand management side, if we have to increase our conservation target, that means we would have to make adjustments or reassessment of our water rates. So in developing our strategy, we did assume for the next few years that there would be no additional inflows to Kachuma or Gibraltar. So that's somewhat conservative, although it has been held true so far. And we have 2 scenarios. So one scenario is where some of our Gibraltar water can be used. We've assumed a 50-50 blend between Gibraltar and Kachuma. And the other scenario is where we can't use any Gibraltar water. We will probably end up somewhere in between these. So they kind of bracket the range of outcomes that may happen at the end of this year. And so this is the first scenario where we are able to use some Gibraltar, and I'll walk through the chart. So we're currently in year 7, water year 2018, and we're projecting out 3 additional years. And starting from the bottom, the purple is our recycled water. This dark blue is Kachuma allocations, so we've assumed no additional allocations from Kachuma going forward. The medium blue is any carryover that we have at Kachuma that is saved from previous years. The light blue is Gibraltar, so here you can see we are able to use some Gibraltar this year, and then it drops off the remaining 3 years. Yellow is groundwater, so if we're able to use Gibraltar this year, we can postpone the use of our turning on our wells until later years of the drought. And then the green and orange are state water, any imported water from the State Water Project. The green distinguishes the allocation versus orange being what we purchased. And then the light green is desalination. And we've assumed a 30% conservation target going forward. And we have seen the community has been exceeding that target, which has been really helpful in preserving our supplies. So we do have this small shortage. It's about 800 acre feet in the year 2021. When we go out that far, it's a little speculative because conditions can change by then. But I think this can be addressed by seeing what happens next year and addressing it next spring or the following year. So we still have some time before we would have to take any actions to address that shortage. And then the other scenario where we can't use any Gibraltar increases that shortage by about 500 acre feet. And we're still in a position where we could address that shortage next year, either through additional conservation or expanding desal or a combination of both. So the discussion on options on how to fill that gap could be postponed until next year. So in summary, our supply is sufficient through 2020 with continued conservation holding our target at 30%. We would like to see the community achieving or exceeding that. And then our level of shortage in 2021 will depend on how much Gibraltar can be used this year, depending on water quality and weather conditions remain dry next year. So decisions that have the additional financial impacts, whether that's increasing the conservation target or expanding desal, can be postponed until spring of 2019. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, if there's one thing that all of us can agree on up here is none of us likes to try to explain water policy to constituents and billing rates and how that works. A couple of questions. In terms of going back to the budget slide that yours were on, once again, we're using a total budget of nearly 15,000 acre feet. Is that correct in that graph?
The water demand, is this in this graph?
Right, which is our historical demand before we get on to...
That's correct. So it was 14,700 made up of recycled and potable water demands.
Right, but our real usage is 30% less than that, is that?
That's correct.
Okay. So, and as we look at the revenue graphs, which is always, this is the fun part we get to try to explain to people who are going crazy with their water bills, is that we're doing a great job. We do such a great job that we fall short of our revenue expectations because we sell water to make revenue, correct? And I think that part of this, as we go forward and we talk about things that are extreme in the stage 3 regulatory environment, we talk about turf bans, other kinds of things that get bandied about, it seems like our people still participate to a greater extent. Every time we ask them to step it up, they go beyond what we ask them to do. Mm-hmm. One thing that I'm getting a lot of comments on is because as people see construction starts, especially with building dense housing and whatnot, are the usages of water compared to what they use normally. I know you've gone over and over this, but I still don't know that the public really has, I certainly don't, have the calculus in mind on how we can tell everybody to do X, Y, and Z while we still density infill new projects, even though they're more efficient. So I think graphically, we need to go a little bit further in describing how that works because we're going to be trying to recover more and more costs from fee-based allocations on or usage-based rates as going forward. So what are our plans as far as that going forward? I know we'll be having these hearings a lot. And in terms of, I know that Ms. Ward does a fabulous job of the conservation message, but that message that we get to hit on the street all the time is, how can you make my lawn brown and yet still you are going forward all this housing, whether it's AUD or ADU or whatever acronyms we're trying to build that day?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, I wish I had a chart up here that shows how our demands have tracked over time, but you can see that what we're using right now is about the same as it was in the 1960s. So we are not seeing an uptick in our demands. And we did at one point bring the conversation to council on how much demand is coming from new development, and it was less than 1% of our total annual demands that was being added based on the projected projects.
And if I could request that we do that kind of going forward so it's a little bit easier to paint that picture because, you know, at some point you get people that have conservation / drought weariness, and we might be losing our mojo at some point in time with the public if we don't somehow graphically represent that in a very cogent way.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, I think certainly the council has wrestled with that, and our new development, I have to look back at those numbers, was somewhere in the 20 acre feet a year is what new demand that brings on in a community that's using about 10,000 acre feet. And so when you attach to it all the economic factors that go with that redevelopment, where upgrading housing, adding additional housing, and the workforce that goes with that, I think that's some of the challenges that we struggle with. The water really doesn't add up to be a huge amount, but it has a huge economic impact on the community to stop that development. And so we're happy to bring that back. We're happy to at least add that to our presentation and remind us how small our new development Certainly when you go out into Goleta, that is a much more significant number. And during the last drought for us, we did stop development because development at that time was a much more significant part of our water supply than it is today. Water conservation requirements have these new developments, as you had mentioned, coming on with strict usage for indoor usage. So, I mean, they just don't add up to be a lot. And in some cases, it's actually a reduction from what's there.
Well, I think it's important because I know that you've presented the information before, but I think that as people see these visual reminders of new construction, new development, even our own project with the proposed, splash thing at the beach, it's important that we budget those so people understand exactly what that is and the percentage of the total budget of water. Thank you.
Good points. Councilmember Snedden?
Thank you. First to Councilmember Rouse, I think new development and dense development definitely uses less water. I mean, if you have a really dense urban core, you're downtown Los Angeles, you're using less water and it's more efficient. But I think the question is if that's what we want to be, even though it uses less water in that way. But that's just to answer you. But to the public, the other thing I'd like to say, I think that's so significant because we have desal. It's masking how serious this situation really is. To be in severe drought for 7 years in a row, and then counting on to the next 3. I know it's a sort of trite term, but the new normal. There's no real indication that I can see that this trend might change, and I really applaud our Water Resources Division for your careful strategic planning and keeping our resources viable. Some things that I would just like to add emphasis to is that this whole plan relies heavily on desal. We're assuming no recharge to Kachuma, which is, if you think about that, if we didn't have desal, what that would look like, no new water into Kachuma, and assuming that Gibraltar is unusable. So that we're even able to talk about sustaining ourselves right now, I think is a huge accomplishment. And also, it would be really wonderful to rest our groundwater basins. I know we've talked about that at Water Commission too, and I'm just going to keep emphasizing that the more that we can rest those, I think, the better. But I just, it's really commendable what you've been able to do with what little resources we have and how diversified our portfolio is, and that we could even talk about water usage when we're planning on having no new inflow to Kachuma is significant.
Mr. Friedman?
I want to echo Councilmember Snedden's comments. I think it is really remarkable how well our community and to the public as well for your efforts day in and day out over these years. I think it's definitely made a difference. I do have a few questions that can kind of help us understand, our options going forward, and because I know like Councilmember Rouse mentioned, it's very confusing, our water policy. The first question, and it gets into this slide, is the projection of groundwater, and we had talked about resting them. What's the current capacity of them, and at what point are we going to be required to rest them because of things like saltwater intrusion or depletion? And I have a few more after that.
Sure. Madam Mayor, Councilmember Friedman, we have a drought yield that's based on modeling, and we also are monitoring our groundwater basin. We have about 60 monitoring wells where we can see what the water levels are, as well as if there's any chlorides coming in. And so our remaining yield of our groundwater basins are about 30% full, and this yellow bar here is that 30%. And we've assumed that once that's used, we would turn our wells off and it's no longer available to us. We are seeing some seawater intrusion in the downtown basin. And so right now it's about halfway between the shoreline and the 101. And our buffer is the 101. So if it ever did approach the 101, that's the point when we would turn our wells off in the downtown basin. But we do have we expect to receive this remaining yield of the yellow bar, which we've spread out over the next few years based on our modeling.
Okay. And then for Kachuma, mentioned is about 40% full, but what's the actual usable percentage? By that, I know there's a dead pool, and then the other question is is the biological opinion for fisheries out yet? And then the follow-up question I have is, what's the capacity for the state water pipe that comes in there? Because what happens is if the lake goes dry or is drying out and everybody's relying on their state water, I know there's a certain capacity for the pipe to actually get that water in, and is that enough to meet all the supplemental water that we would need and all galitas and all those, or is that pipe just too small to meet all those needs?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Friedman, so the 40% allocation is for this year. We are working with the other Kachuma member units right now on whether we could, if there's any available supply for an allocation for the next water year, which is October 1st, when reclamation would determine what next year's allocation is. We don't have a number yet, but we will be making a request. These projections assume we don't receive one, and so it would be a better case scenario if we did. But there is some water that's unallocated in the reservoir. It's not very much. So it won't be a full allocation next year, but hopefully partial. The biological opinion has not yet been released publicly. If that did, long term, it would likely have a significant effect on our water supplies. For this particular outlook, we've assumed a zero allocation, so there's really nothing to reduce it by if the biological opinion came out. We've taken the position that if water's already been allocated and is under our ownership as carryover, it belongs to the member units and isn't available for fish releases. It's no longer under the Bureau's discretion how it's used. And then the last question regarding the State Water Project, the capacity, I believe, is about 15,000 acre feet. Going into Kachuma, the city's portion of that is about 3,300 acre feet. And so we've planned to keep that pipe, the city's portion of that pipe, flowing full all the way through 2021. So if we don't get a 100% allocation from the State Water Project, we would go out and pursue supplemental purchases to keep the city's portion of the pipe full. Right now, everyone's sending water. If an agency runs out of water and doesn't have it to send, another agency can use that excess capacity, and that's been what's occurring recently.
So we have enough based on the pipe capacity to meet our percentage of that.
Correct.
And I have just two more questions on the water debt. I know there's a timeline, usually 10 years, that you have to repay it, and you can get an extension. But what happens if the drought continues and some of that water, and we have to repay the debt? Is it just getting an extension that would kind of be the practice, or so you can extend it beyond 10 or even 20 years, correct?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Freeman, that's correct. You can request an extension for that repayment for extraordinary conditions such as a 10-year drought.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that, especially for the public, so they understand we're not giving water away to repay it at the time we need it. And the last one is, given these projections and our groundwater kind of going past 2021, how long, we've talked in the previous council meetings about the potential to increase our capacity of the desal by building the conduit to go up to the Cater plant. About how long would that take, that process, once we go forward, we get the designs, we're in negotiations with Montecito, but from that time forward, in terms of getting funding for construction, actual construction itself, and permitting, would that take to actually build that conduit? Because I think that potentially could be a key piece if we still have an extended drought going on 10, 15 years, and all these other sources, our groundwater runs out, state water gets 5% allocation in the past. Just trying to understand that time frame.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Freeman, yeah, we've been actually preparing for that, and we believe it's a 2-year window to do the expansion, and the majority of that is the conveyance pipeline and getting that constructed. So that's generally the time we believe it's necessary to do the design and construction to actually have physical water delivered. So we're working with that, and that's kind of playing into why we believe we have another year to put off that decision and revisit that next year if things continue to remain dry.
Good. Okay, Mr. Dominguez.
Just expanding on the comments earlier about the environmental aspect of the water use and housing. The important thing is to look at the bigger picture, not just does a new toilet use less water than an old toilet, does a new building use less water than an old building. We all know that. Really, what's the consequences in California regionally and building housing in Santa Barbara versus other areas? Why are we building housing here versus, say, the Sacramento area, the Delta area, where there's a lot more water, where you don't have to use electricity and greenhouse gases to move the water here? If you look at our picture here of Santa Barbara, there's many fewer trees in that picture than there are now. And before those people were there were almost no trees, right? This is pretty much a desert, arid environment. We have to import all the water to support our lifestyles here. So even though it may take less with these newer, higher tech buildings, it still causes a problem to the ecosystem of California. So I want to make sure when we're looking at adding new units, we look at the entire environmental impact, not just one particular index. And the other impacts are traffic. I mean, this is kind of a segue into our next agenda item. What are the actual costs of putting in housing if housing goes to one segment of the society and that creates a greater demand for housing in other segments and puts more people on freeways commuting from Ventura, commuting from Santa Maria, commuting from Lompoc? Is that good ultimately for either the environment or the economy?
Very good. Do we have public comment? So if there's no other comments, we'll go ahead and receive your report. Very sobering. A lot of people in the audience, you heard it, folks. We're still in a severe drought, and thank you for your conservation efforts, and please continue them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Water staff. Next item. Should we keep going? Does anyone need a break? Okay, we're charging ahead. What's the item, Madam Clerk?
Item number 16, subject contract for design options and environmental review for the Mission Canyon Bridge Safety Project.
Thank you. Mr. Dayton, are you starting us off?